Have you ever stopped to think that those charming stories that marked your childhood might hide disturbing secrets? Yes, the fairy tales that seem so innocent, with their brave princesses, charming princes, and happy endings, carry hidden messages that few are aware of. What would you do if you found out that Little Red Riding Hood involved cannibalism, or that Sleeping Beauty was inspired by rape and pregnancy while in a coma? It seems absurd, but it's true. These narratives, now associated with Disney's Happily Ever After, were originally created to explore humanity's deepest fears. So, get ready to dive into a world where nothing is what it seems and where every page can reveal a shocking truth. Are you ready to face the dark side of fairy tales? Have you ever stopped to think that fairy tales might be more than just simple stories to entertain children? In fact, many of these tales carry hidden messages that have shaped behaviors for generations. For example, when diving into the original versions of the Brothers Grimm, we notice they weren't exactly about happily ever after. Sleeping Beauty, as enchanting as it may seem today, contained disturbing elements that go beyond romanticism. Were these narratives created only to teach moral lessons, or did they have a darker purpose? Reflect. Are we blind to the true intentions behind these stories? Imagine telling a story like Hansel and Gretel to modern children without softening the macabre details. In the original version, there are clear references to hunger and cannibalism, reflections of difficult times in the Middle Ages. These tales functioned almost like survival manuals, but they also sowed fear to control behavior. They taught that disobeying parents or venturing out alone could result in terrible tragedies. Today, when we read Disney adaptations, it's easy to overlook these deep layers, but they are there, hidden between the lines. Who knows, maybe you'll discover something new when revisiting these works. And what if I told you that even Little Red Riding Hood, that classic tale about kindness and cleverness, was written with much darker tones? In its origin, this narrative openly spoke about violence and danger. The wolf, a clear symbol of external threats, represented much more than just a cartoonish villain. When observing these stories from this new perspective, we begin to question, were these accounts meant to educate or manipulate? Perhaps both. But before we arrive at that answer, let's explore another fascinating tale, the one involving a red hood and sharp teeth. Little Red Riding Hood. Ah, Little Red Riding Hood. Who doesn't know this brave little girl who faces a hungry wolf? But wait a minute, did you know that, in the original versions of the Brothers Grimm, this story was far less innocent than it seems? In fact, the narrative included scenes of cannibalism and explicit violence. Yes, the wolf not only swallowed the grandmother but also served her parts disguised in a meal for Little Red Riding Hood herself. Sounds like it came out of a horror movie, doesn't it? These dark elements had the clear aim of warning the young about the dangers of the outside world. Now think about it, if someone today told this version to children, it would probably cause more nightmares than peaceful dreams. However, at the time these stories emerged, they reflected the harsh realities of daily life. The wolf, for instance, symbolized human predators that roamed villages, threatening innocents. The moral of the story was clear: beware of strangers and never stray from the safe path. Today, while watching the Disney adaptation, we can hardly associate this tale with its macabre past. Have we lost something important by making it so light? And what if I tell you there's an even more disturbing version? In some ancient adaptations, the hunter who saves Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother is portrayed almost like a brutal vigilante. He not only kills the wolf but does so in a graphic and visceral manner. This bloody revenge serves as a reminder that even the heroes can have dark sides. As we analyze these hidden layers, we realize that fairy tales are much more complex than they appear. And speaking of complexity, get ready to delve into the next tale, where a sleeping princess faces dangers that go beyond a simple spell. Sleeping Beauty. When we think of Sleeping Beauty, we immediately picture a sleeping princess waiting to be awakened by the kiss of a charming prince. Seems romantic, doesn't it? But, if you knew the original versions of this story, you might reconsider all that charm. In fact, some older adaptations narrate something much more disturbing. The princess isn't awakened by love, but rather after suffering sexual abuse while deeply asleep. That's right, in these tales, she is a victim of rape, falls into a coma, and gives birth to 2 children before finally waking up. It's not exactly the happily ever after sold to us on Disney screens, is it? But wait, because there's more. In some lesser-known versions, the villain isn't just the spell cast on the princess, but also someone close to her. Imagine this: after the birth of the babies, her own mother-in-law tries to kill them to hide the scandal. Yes, the original story includes elements of infanticide and family conspiracy, creating an atmosphere so dark it would be hard even for fans of modern thrillers. These details show how fairy tales were used to explore taboo themes of society, reflecting human fears and dilemmas in a raw and relentless way. Today, as we watch modern adaptations, we can hardly associate these disturbing accounts with the lightness of current animations. However, by removing these dark elements, are we losing opportunities to teach important lessons? For example, by preserving realistic and complex aspects of the stories, we could help new generations deal with difficult issues in life. But, of course, there is always a limit between what is necessary and what can traumatize. And speaking of trauma, get ready to meet Hansel and Gretel, whose story is based on even more brutal events of the Middle Ages. Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel is a story that, at first glance, seems simple. 2 children get lost in the forest and find a house made of sweets. But, upon examining the original versions of this narrative, we discover that it has deep roots in dark events of the Middle Ages, including real cases of famine and cannibalism. Yes, you heard right. During times of extreme scarcity, historical records show that some people resorted to cannibalism as a last resort for survival. This brutal reality was transformed into a cautionary tale, where the cannibal which symbolizes the dangers that lurked around desperate families. And what if I told you that the very idea of abandoning children in the forest wasn't as fictional as it seems? Back then, poor families sometimes left their children in the woods because they couldn't afford to feed them. Hansel and Gretel, therefore, can be seen as representatives of these vulnerable children, fighting against abandonment and the cruelty of the adult world. The witch, with her hot oven and sugary house, is much more than a caricatured villain. She is a metaphor for human predators who exploited the weak. It's no wonder this story still gives us chills, even in its softened versions. Today, while watching modern adaptations, we can hardly associate these terrible elements with the lightness of current animations. Nevertheless, the original versions of the Brothers Grimm bring up issues that remain relevant: the struggle against poverty, the fear of abandonment, and human violence disguised as magic. And if we think about it, even current problems can be reflected in this ancestral narrative. But before we delve into that reflection, get ready to meet another classic tale, where 3 little pigs face a fate far from happy in the clutches of a voracious wolf. The 3 Little Pigs. Ah, the 3 Little Pigs. A story that seems simple and even fun, right? But, if you look closer at the original versions of this narrative, you'll see that it isn't as childish as it appears. In fact, in some older adaptations, the wolf not only blows the houses down but also devours the first 2 pigs without any mercy. Yes, we're talking about animal infanticide, a scene that would certainly give any modern child nightmares. These brutal elements reflect an uncompromising moral: those who don't work hard or build strong foundations are doomed to failure, or, in this case, to the wolf's stomach. But the story doesn't end with the wolf satisfied after his bloody feast. The 3rd pig, the one who built his house of bricks, puts on a masterclass in cunning and revenge. He not only repeatedly tricks the wolf but also leads him to a cruel death at the end, usually by cooking him alive or throwing him into a boiling cauldron. Sounds like it came out of a horror story, doesn't it? This brutal revenge serves as a reminder that even the weakest can defeat their oppressors, but always at the cost of violence and cruelty. Does this lesson still apply today, or do we need to rethink our narratives? And if we stop to think about it, these fairy tales are much more than entertainment. They mirror the dark realities of the societies in which they were created. In the case of the Three Little Pigs, the message about hard work and strategic planning is clear, but there's also a disturbing subtext about punishment and retribution. Today, as we watch animated versions of this tale, we can hardly associate these deep layers with the simplicity of modern adaptations. And what if I told you there's another equally fascinating tale, where a cursed prince lives in a castle haunted by his own curse? Get ready to explore Beauty and the Beast, based on a real case that mixes love, deformity, and something known as werewolf syndrome. Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast. One of the most enchanting stories ever told, right? But what if I told you that this narrative might have roots in real events, involving a man who suffered from something known as werewolf syndrome? Yes, this condition, characterized by aggressive behavior, physical deformities, and social isolation, may have inspired the figure of the Beast. Instead of being just a metaphor for deceptive appearances, the story might have been based on an 18th-century French nobleman, whose lonely life and frightening appearance made him a kind of monster in the eyes of society. Think about it, could the magic of fairy tales actually be a way of humanizing human tragedies? This darker version of the story makes us reflect on how we deal with those who are different from us. After all, the Beast isn't just a villain, he is a victim of circumstances beyond his control. His transformation throughout the narrative symbolizes the hope that even the most marginalized can find redemption through love and understanding. However, it's worth remembering that, in modern adaptations, much of this complexity has been softened. Today, we see the Beast as a romantic character, but originally he was much scarier, a reminder that acceptance doesn't always come easily. And if we think about it, this story also teaches us something profound about human nature. We all carry scars, physical or emotional, that can make us feel like beasts in the world. But, just like in the tale, there's always the possibility of transformation, as long as we're willing to face our own fears. However, before we delve into this reflection, get ready to explore even more macabre and bizarre fairy tales, those that were forgotten by time but promise to chill even the bravest hearts. The most macabre fairy tales you've never heard of. You've probably heard of Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and Sleeping Beauty. But did you know there are fairy tales so dark and bizarre that we can hardly believe they were created for entertainment? These forgotten stories are true treasures of folk horror, full of elements that challenge our imagination. For example, there's a tale by the Brothers Grimm called The Boy Who Went Forth to Learn Fear, where the protagonist faces soaked corpses, demonic cats, and even public executions, all in search of learning to feel fear. Sounds more like an episode of a horror series than a children's story, doesn't it? And what if I tell you about another tale called The Girl Without Hands? In this disturbing narrative, a young woman has her hands cut off by her own father after he makes a pact with the devil. She then wanders the world, facing humiliation and trials, until finding redemption through a miraculous marriage. Stories like this were used to explore themes such as sacrifice, guilt, and resilience, but also to instill fear in children. Today, these tales seem exaggerated, but back then they reflected the fears and moral dilemmas of society. Have we lost something by leaving them in oblivion? These macabre stories remind us that fairy tales weren't just about happy endings, they were mirrors of human darkness, full of tough lessons and deep reflections. By revisiting these forgotten accounts, we can rediscover hidden layers of meaning that still resonate with us today. However, before we embark on this journey, get ready to explore something even more shocking: the fairy tales that were censored or banned for being considered too disturbing for the public. What could they have tried to hide from us? The censored fairy tales, what they don't want you to know. Have you ever stopped to think that some stories might be so disturbing that they needed to be hidden from the public? Well, there are fairy tales that were censored or altered over the centuries precisely because of that. For example, the tale of the Glass Mountain, a narrative full of graphic violence and taboo themes, was almost completely erased from modern collections. In it, the protagonist faces challenges that include mutilations, demonic pacts, and even veiled incest. These elements were considered unacceptable for children, but did simply ignoring them solve the problem, or did it just deprive us of better understanding our own shadows? Another fascinating example is the tale, The Jew in the Thornbush, which was banned for its unethical message and caricatured portrayal of minorities. In it, a cruel man is repeatedly punished for his greed, but the way this punishment is presented carries tones of prejudice and hate. Although it's understandable that this type of story has no place in our modern society, its erasure also raises important questions. By removing these narratives, are we denying the opportunity to discuss the mistakes of the past? Or are some secrets better left buried to avoid further harm? These censored tales show us that the Brothers Grimm and other compilers were willing to explore extreme themes to capture the essence of the human condition. However, as time passed, these stories were softened or eliminated to fit the moral standards of the time. Today, while watching Disney adaptations, we can hardly imagine that such crude and controversial versions once existed. But what happened to these stories along the way? How were they transformed to become suitable for the children's audience? Get ready to unravel how fairy tales were adapted for the modern world. Comparison with modern adaptations. If you compare the original versions of fairy tales with modern Disney adaptations, you'll notice there's a huge gap between them. While the Brothers Grimm stories were full of violence, cannibalism, and hard lessons, the animated versions are filled with musicality, vibrant colors, and happy endings. For example, in Disney's adaptation of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf is portrayed as a comical and clumsy villain, instead of the ruthless predator that devoured victims without mercy in the old versions. This transformation not only softened the narratives but also completely changed the original purpose of these stories, from dark warnings to light entertainment. But was this change really positive? By removing the disturbing elements, modern adaptations lost part of the moral impact that made these tales so powerful. For instance, in Hansel and Gretel, Disney completely omitted the cannibalism and turned the witch into an almost ridiculous, caricatured figure. While this makes the story more accessible for children, it also removes the opportunity to discuss profound themes like hunger and the fear of abandonment. Are we underestimating the ability of new generations to handle complexity? Or does the modern world simply have no room for such raw stories? At the same time, it's undeniable that modern adaptations brought something valuable: hope. While the original versions often ended ambiguously or even tragically, today's stories always offer an optimistic ending. Sleeping Beauty, for example, swapped rape and pregnancy in a coma for a romantic kiss and a castle celebrating true love. This contrast makes us reflect on the role fairy tales play in our culture. Should they prepare children for harsh reality or protect them from it? So, what did you think of this journey through the dark backstage of fairy tales? Discovering that seemingly innocent stories hide themes like cannibalism, infanticide, and violence can be disturbing, but it also invites us to rethink the role of these narratives in our lives. Were they created just to entertain, or is there something deeper in their essence? How can you use this knowledge to see the world differently? Maybe it's time to revisit your favorite stories with a new critical eye. Your like is important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.